I am super excited to be here with you, Geena Rocero, to talk about your new book, your memoir, Horse Barbie, and really talk about your life, because to say it is an extraordinary life, I think, is a massive understatement. Before we talk about the content of your book and your story, I just wanted to ask you a bit about the process of writing it.
Yeah.
As someone who recently wrote a memoir, I'm curious what it was like for you to chronicle your entire life.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for asking that. I have to say, as a storyteller, I've been producing, contributed essays. This is obviously a very different process. I wrote this during the pandemic, and it was 2 years of writing. And it's just that process of getting in my space from 9 to 3 o'clock. I'm a morning creative. By 3 p.m., there's nothing. I'm quite literally exhausted, and I need to just completely chill down.
You're tapped out.
I'm tapped out, and I was doing this for 2 years, 9 to 3 every day. I get there in my space, 9, and I like the process and the feeling of I'm easing into it. I actually don't usually start until like 10, right? I would listen to a podcast, I would read a book, or light up a candle, have a little process, or read a page of another person's memoir, and just getting into it. And I'm sure you know this, but in that process where I could feel that I'm sort of entering a different world, or I'm levitating, I knew there's something. And I would feel that when I would get to that zone and I would snap out of it and look at the thing that I wrote, it's almost magic, So I enjoy being there. So I think that's what kept me going back for 2 years, every day, 9 to 3.
Wow, that takes a lot of discipline.
Yeah, I really became that writer because, as I said, I've never written this before. And I just sort of it's obviously during the pandemic, nowhere to go. There's been a lot of conversation of me wanting to write the book, and, nowhere to go. Let me do it.
When I wrote my book, a lot of people said, why now? Which I thought was sometimes a dumb question, but sometimes an interesting question. So I'm curious, why now for you at this stage in your life? Did you feel you wanted to write a memoir because you told your story to the world in a TED Talk in 2014?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious, was there some kind of motivation? Did you decide, I've done my TED Talk, but I want to get more in than I was able to in an 18-minute conversation? How long is a TED Talk?
Mine was actually 10 minutes only.
10 minutes.
Yes.
Wow, that is really hard. Did you think, gosh, I want to do more than a 10-minute TED Talk? My story is more complex and interesting than that.
Yeah, there's that part. But also, this book, I felt like it's a process for me too. Because I went from, what I shared in that TED Talk, I went from being stealth as a fashion model, where the industry didn't know, my model agent did not know I was trans, right? I was hiding. I was living these two realities. I went from being stealth to TED Talk, to United Nations, to traveling the world advocating for trans rights. And it felt like I was missing that in-between. I didn't get a chance to process that in-between. And writing this book was my process to unpack a lot more. And, the book is sort of like chronological, but when I was writing, I didn't write it chronological and really went straight to my time in New York City when I was a model, because I felt like, if I'm going to do this, which is this big task, let me focus on, I think, the most difficult part in my journey, which is crazy because I was modeling, but it was also the most traumatic, in my life.
In fact, the book starts with you in a John Legend music video in 2005.
Mm-hmm.
And the anxiety you felt, honestly, I felt anxiety just reading those pages, worried and so concerned that you would be found out, and how agonizing that was.
Yeah.
Why did you want to start with that?
Oh, give me goosebumps. I think it represented a lot of things in my journey. But, in the book, you could also, there's a lot of magical coincidence in the book. In that beginning of that story, the title of the song itself, which is "Now Who Is She?" And then the lyrics that he was singing to me during my part of the music video was just incredibly like magical coincidence that he's asking me who I am, but also the part of the scene in the book, the scene where I was talking about it in my book was I was sort of in the shadow behind the scenes,
Right.
right? And it was I think it encapsulates that feeling that I was going through as a fashion model at the time in 2005 because I was so visible, but I was also invisible, consciously invisible at the same time, while at the same time feeling sexy, feeling myself, feeling like my dream, but at the same time knowing this conversation that's in my head in that moment where I need to be careful. But I also need to do good so I could really continue this job. This could be a big
Great
launching
for you,
yeah,
right?
just like many.
You talked about other music videos with Christy Turlington and who else? I guess it was the George Michael
George
video
Michael video,
where it really catapulted.
Helena Christensen,
Right.
like those iconic moments, in my head, I was going to have that moment, so of course I wanted to do it. So I felt starting with that, it really just encapsulates a lot of, what the book is about,
And that anxiety of being who you are privately, but not who you are publicly.
All of those things happening at the same time, and it's in as much as this was a dream that I've had growing up in the Philippines, and it was a dream come true. But that little femboy that who I am in the Philippines, thinking like I can't believe this is happening. I'm actually doing this. But then some parts of me really wants to just like get me out of here. I cannot continue doing this, because it
I
was
can't
really
keep living a lie, basically.
can't keep living up, to this story that I have to keep up, because I am living my truth, right? The other perspective from other people might not see it in that way, and that's I think some people that have read the book, they find it so complicated, and I like to think I'm a very complicated woman, So, yeah.
Let's talk about your childhood because I loved reading about it. It was so evocative with your siblings and walking into your house and smelling Clorox on the linoleum floors and then walking a little further and seeing your dad fixing dinner while your mom was at work. Talk to me a little bit about, and I also loved when there was a big thunder shower and you all would kind of luxuriate in this makeshift natural shower and all the little Filipino kids running around.
Yes.
It sounds like you had I don't think modest, I think probably that's too much. I mean, a pretty simple, I don't think you were poor, but you were.
Yeah, it's funny you're asking this because I'm actually asking this question now. Somebody asked, I mean, I don't think at the time in the Philippines there's no such thing as considered like middle class. It's just the beginning. But I mean, my mom was working, but I definitely know at the end of the month we're always running into like who do we borrow money from to put food in the table. We're always running out of money for sure. So my mom was working. My dad
Right.
was a stay-at-home dad. So
Which was
for
very
working
unusual
class,
for the time, right?
yeah, it's Philippines has a very long history of matriarchal society, but also in the context of very patriarchal control as well. But the woman runs the country. Like small businesses are run by women. My mom is a very strong woman, so definitely, at the time I didn't see it like as the reverse role. It's just obviously I was young. There's no
Right.
critical analysis. I knew my mom goes to work. And then my dad stay at home, and he's the best stay-at-home dad,
Except when he drank, and then things got a little hairy.
Very, very hairy.
And it was hard for him. It was hard for him to have, even if it's a matriarchal society, it was clear from your writing that it wasn't easy having your mom as the breadwinner for
Yeah.
him, right?
I have not spoken so much about my dad, and this book was the first time really like talking about it. Even in my TED Talk, I shared obviously the support and the love of my mom, and this book was actually the first one where I was really, able to process what that was. I'm sure I haven't really unpacked. This is my own perspective. I'm sure my cousins, my sisters, my aunties would have a different point of views, but certainly this book was my first time to really remember a lot of the complication, of the relationship with my dad, because I always remember, being taken, by him at the wet market and going every day, taking me to, learn. I think in some way I learned how to be comfortable in the kitchen. I love cooking because of my dad, because of that bonding that we had, right? I mean, every day at 6 p.m. we would go to Guadalupe Public Market. It's a famous public wet market in the Philippines. And it was our bonding moment. And we would come home and he would cook, and he's known to be like the best chef in the neighborhood. Actually, even during fiestas in the Philippines, it's a lot of informal economy in the Philippines, and that's one of his side jobs. He would get hired to cook in a fiesta, but then it's fiesta, there's drinking, and he would come home drinking. And that kind of, obviously now I know a little bit. I think that's, I guess, unexpressed, masculinity, or like maybe that feeling of guilt that he wasn't the provider, took its toll. And I think it's expressed in that very violent rage.
Talk about your mom for a moment. She was one of the reasons kids didn't pick on you when you were younger, Geena, and she was quite an imposing figure. Tell us about her and what her job was and the kind of respect she had in the community.
Oh, my mom. She, everybody calls her Mom Rocero because she is so well loved. She taught third grade, but she does so many things. She's obviously very entrepreneurial. I think I got a lot of that, from her on wanting to, whether it's hustle, whether it's the self-belief that you could do it. She was a school teacher, but she would take, I was the youngest of four, I was the baby. She would take me to, she would have a side hustle to sell kikaman soy sauce and go and drop me off, leave me in a taxi while she's dropping off kikaman soy sauce in different Japanese restaurant.
That she was able to convince the people at the dock to give her, right, to sell?
She would have different contacts, and then she would also create all the costumes during school performances when we were growing up. And I think some part of the performance I got from her, because she was also a choreographer. She would also take me to a market where you could buy like peanuts, like snacks in bulk, and then she would like repackage that and then sell it in the school canteen. Like, she's always trying to figure out how she could make extra money.
And you would sell these sweets. Tell me what those sweets were. They sounded really good, by the way.
Yeah, Filipinos love sweets, that's for sure. Especially, we eat sweet. Morning, night, every.
And those bananas, those caramelized bananas that you talk about, it's kind of filling the streets with a certain fragrance. That made me hungry too. But tell me about what you would sell, Geena.
The one that I would sell is this thing called kalamay, which is like coconut sticky rice with caramelized on top. And we do this, it's a summer job for us, like here you hear a different summer job. Here we're selling sticky rice with coconut, and it would be like in a small 12-inch tray, and I would walk around the neighborhood to get extra money so I could pay for the swimming pool where I could like join the other kids. And it was even though it's like this tiny little pool, it was almost like a status thing where you're in a pool. We didn't have any pool unless it's raining, and then we could like swim in the flood. That's what we did. We had fun as kids, and it was my way to pay to the entrance fee to the that pool, but also. Because I was in our neighborhood, but I would be so good in playing different games. But it becomes a sense of competition in different neighborhoods. And, there's definitely a sense when every time I would, walk around and sell that kalamay, the tray in the neighborhood, if it's a neighborhood where they don't know me or a group of kids, particularly young boys, that I beat them on a different game, and they know me that I'm the best, they would throw rocks at me. And I just knew when, I talk about in the book, when you're walking around, you actually say it and you announce to the neighborhood, that you announce the name of the coconut rice called kalamay, and you're walking around. It means you're arriving, right? And people know what that is, so they would arrive. But I know when I say that, when I say kalamay, and then somebody replied with this other thing, which is like a diss to it, saying kalamay, kinakamay ng patay, meaning you're about to be dead here. And then the rocks would follow, and they would throw rocks at me, and I would just run away.
Why would they throw rocks at you?
I think a combination of both. I think because first I beat them in different games. We have this game called Tex, and I'm so good at it, and I was known in the neighborhood. And it's particularly like a boys' game. Like the little boys in the neighborhood would play that. So I think that's one reason, because I'm the best at it. But also I think it's because they know I'm also this very femme child. Like the way I walk has a certain sway, the word called kembot, and I was so unapologetic with it. So maybe the sense that this femme boy beating us in our game, how could she,
I want to talk to you about when you first had this feeling. You talk about being in the choir and leading the choir and what a strong influence your mom was. But you also describe a scene early on where you're wearing your shirt on your head. So it appears that, your shirt isn't off. It's sort of around your forehead, and it appears as if it's long hair, or you're imagining it's your long hair. And you're looking
I'm
in
feeling
the
it
mirror.
was my long hair.
Yeah.
Katie, it was my long hair.
Yeah. So how old were you at that moment, Geena? And what did you see in the mirror? And was that the moment you said, yes, this is who I am? Or were there other moments leading up to that?
I think that was the first time. I'm probably around 5, 6 years old. That was probably the first time where I felt that recognition. And when people say, what are your early memories? I'd like to think that's the thing that's kept on coming up because it was so strong. I mean, early memories are playing around and all that, but that's the one that was so significant to me. Looking in that mirror, sweaty, coming off, from being teased outside, and looking at myself in the mirror with, again, the T-shirt on my head, feeling like this is the fullness of my fantasy, playing with it. I really felt like it was my hair. It was not a T-shirt at that point. And to see that in the mirror, the reflection at such a young age, that knowledge that this is who I am, and saying it first to myself was powerful, I think.
There are many trans people I've talked to say from a very early age they felt not comfortable in their bodies, not comfortable in their skin, that something was wrong. Did you sense that even before you had that moment in the mirror?
Yeah. I like to say I work a lot with trans youth. I speak a lot, obviously in different spaces. For me personally, looking at, in the mirror and who I am, trans people, especially young trans people, we know, we know that truth and how powerful it is. It becomes uncomfortable when we go outside, our immediate surrounding or safe spaces or neighborhoods or communities that doesn't accept it. That's when it becomes uncomfortable. Or the early messages that we receive about who we're supposed to be. That's when it becomes uncomfortable. But the truth of that recognition is very present to every single young trans person. I knew it happened to me. I know, the places when I travel, when I talk to trans youth and then their family, it's very early. We knew at a very early age.
I'm fascinated how different it is in the Philippines in terms of the way transgender people and trans culture in general is treated and seen. You write, when I was growing up, Catholicism and trans beauty pageants inspired equal fanaticism. Families would go straight from Mass to watching the Serena trans pageants on TV back at home. No one really saw this as a paradox. It was just part of our unique cultural blend. That is so wild and so fascinating to me that this conservative Catholic country has a very expansive view of gender and a very accepting view of gender in general.
I'd like to say I want to offer a very, I guess, more nuanced context here. Acceptance is a very, very big word.
Right, because there is a lot of bigotry that we'll talk about and a lot of harassment, as we've described, and
Certainly.
also legal inequality for trans people. But before we talk about that, Geena, tell me about sort of why it is celebrated. And you were a femme boy.
Yes.
And you talk about sort of the way you walked, and it never felt like you were full of shame for who you were. And that is, I think, a pretty foreign concept here in the United States.
Yeah, shame is a big component, especially when I moved here. But growing up, that culture that we have, it's very embedded in our culture, gender fluidity. We don't have he or she in our language. Our one of our main language, Tagalog, and which is part of this language called Austronesian language family, spoken by close to 400 million people. Majority of those languages are gender neutral.
Right.
So it's very much embedded in our culture pre-colonial in the Philippines. And then 1521, Ferdinand Magellan got to the Philippines, colonized the Philippines through resistance by, obviously, indigenous communities in the Philippines. Unfortunately, succeeded for 333 years. I described in the book, I felt like Philippines was, this journalist, Carmen Nakpil Guerrero, famously said it, that Philippines was stuck in a convent for 333 years and then came out to, Hollywood for 50 years. That's quite loaded, complicated forces. But because it's so embedded in our culture, pre-colonial times, and then Catholicism, sort of took over in the Philippines, all over the Philippines, and then instituted this thing called Catholic Fiesta celebration, which is year-round celebrating saints, patrons in different neighborhoods all over the Philippines, where in the mountains, in the national television. But during those fiesta celebrations, which is a Catholic celebration, which is usually a 5-day celebration, on that 5th day, usually that ends on a Sunday, the main event for everybody to go see is transgender beauty pageants, where the whole family watches it, and it's just part of how we celebrate it because it's been embedded in our culture. For people that are watching, it's part entertainment. Majority of it's entertainment. For us, it was a job because it was systematic, and that became my job when I was 15, joining pageants, because it happened every year. Actually, during the month of May, there's a pageant almost every single day all over the Philippines, which means there's trans pageants every day all over the Philippines during the month of May.
And growing up in that environment, did it make you feel much more comfortable with your early gender fluidity and the fact that, that you carried yourself like a girl and not like a boy? And was that another reason, Geena, your mom was so accepting of you? That to me is also such a foreign concept. I think we're seeing that change here in this country, but it is a very, very upsetting to many parents process when a child says he or she is trans or, is not the gender they were assigned at birth. And yet there was never that tumult in your family, Geena, right? I mean, can you explain sort of your mom watching you? You describe her, radiantly watching you with so much pride. There was never any kind of conflict for her.
Yeah. Certainly she had questions, especially as we've gotten closer in our relationship, in our woman-to-woman conversations. She'd had questions, but at that time, growing up, I think because I wouldn't even say like it's the power, it's so easy for me to say it's the power of representation. It's cultural, it's so embedded it's in our language, it's in our every society. I like to say that trans people are culturally mainstream visible in the Philippines, right? We're part of society. We're part of the Catholic celebrations. We're in every facets of culture in the Philippines. So the fact that there's a certain familiarity helps. I also recognize how lucky I am to have mom, even my dad, who fully accepted me and loved me. Not one resistance to it all.
Were most parents like your parents in the Philippines, or were they very unusual?
Very unusual. My mom just said like she loved me. My mom tells the story to me that growing up, Philippines love telenovelas. We would watch telenovelas, and it's a family gathering that we would do. And at such an early age, I would express playing with Barbies. So every time they would take away my Barbies, I would cry so loud that they can't watch their telenovela. So they would rather let me play with my Barbie so they could watch their telenovela. So even instances like that she's to tell me. And I guess it's love, I guess, my mom truly just loves me. That notions of like how Catholicism, certainly Philippines, you could easily find really radical, religious zealots that would really protest about this, even in our political realm in the Philippines. But, that's my mom and my dad just somehow found that in them to accept me and love me.
Your siblings, how about them? You're the youngest. It wasn't quite as easy always for each of your siblings, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm the youngest, brother's the oldest, sister, and then my other sister that I grew up close together. And actually, my sister was, even at such a young age, it was a little bit of a reverse role because she was more tomboyish.
Right.
And
which
I was the
funny.
one playing with her Barbies, and she would give me her Barbie. She would let me steal her Barbie at some point at the beginning. And even that, just the thought of, okay, you would allow me to do that, and then you could have my fire trucks. Great, and that's how I grew up. My brother is a little different. He's the definitely machismo one, and he would knucklehead me, to when he would see me like playing with feminine clothing, but also we would bond playing, video games together. I'm also, his baby brother, the youngest. So there's also that care, but also I guess the expectations, how he's feeling about his masculinity, is expressed through that, resistance by the knucklehead.
I want to read this very short paragraph just to kind of give a sense of what your childhood was like. We don't have to talk more about it, but I feel like I didn't maybe represent your, where you grew up. So you write in your book about your childhood, you write, in all, there were 6 of us, my mother, my father, my 2 sisters, my brother, and me, living in what was effectively a 9 by 12-foot room separated from our neighbors by a flimsy plywood wall. In fact, you talked about hearing, I guess, relatives were
My auntie.
your auntie was and her family were above you, and you'd play guessing games who's walking above us now. But it was a very simple life. It wasn't you didn't have you your needs were met, but it was not super privileged, to say the least.
Privilege definitely does not even enter in that conversation. I think it's very communal, I'd say. You know, everybody knows each other. Philippine is the Austronesian language family, the Pacific Island Filipinos. We're very communal, moving to America and understanding the individual, the individual is the one, was a very foreign concept to me. We have this thing, this virtue in the Philippines called kapwa, which is all about you are a reflection of your community and then the other person. So it's all about you're never doing things by yourself. It's always, we're out of rice, let's just walk into our neighborhood and just grab their rice. Because when they run out of rice, they will come to our house, no problem, does not close the door. Also in the neighborhood where I grew up, everybody lived next to each other. Everybody knew each other.
And lots of little kids running around, taking showers when...
I was always outside.
Outside.
I was a sun kid. I was always outside.
In
playing.
fact, you talked about colorism in the Philippines, right? Mm-hmm. That many people aspired to be really pale, but because you spent so much time in the sun, you were called the sun kid. And did that make you feel less than in a way, or how did that work out?
I mean, at such an early age, I've been hearing that. I definitely was hearing that. It's a message that you hear. My mom said that to me. My sister said that to me.
Is it a put down, or?
It's definitely a put down. Still to this day, even it's because I've lived half of my life in the Philippines, half here in America. I always feel like I have that very, I'm always straddling between am I thinking from a very, community-based thought process, but also this ambition of this individual in America. So it's always straddling between, but particularly when it comes to colorism, it's so embedded. It's in you see it on television, you see it in billboards. We have products that sells whitening products. In fact, when I started joining pageants, I did the same thing because that was the ideal. It was not, also, again, I was very young. There's no critical analysis of what this means, right? I grew up in a very, colonized mentality. Let me say that as well. It's not until people have asked this, I feel it's not until I left my motherland in order for me to really know my motherland. It's not until I moved to America and sort of see it from the outside and what it means to grow up in a very colonial mindset, that self-hate of your skin color. I mean, the Philippines is in the, equator. It's hot. But to feel shame by the color of your skin, by playing outside and you're shamed because you have a dark skin,
I guess because it represented sort of the lower classes, if you will, the workers, the people who were out in the sun all day.
It's very much, rooted in, again, colonialism, when, Spain got to the Philippines, the rich people always have the people working in the fields. And if you're working in the fields, working for, the colonizer, you are the lower class. So definitely, it's very much embedded, and it's still very much like that.
You write that in the Philippines, we are culturally visible but legally erased. To this day, trans Filipinas have M gender markers on their documents and cannot change their names in court. We don't have robust anti-discrimination protections. No amount of pageant glory can make up for the fact that our government still doesn't see and treat trans people as full citizens able to participate in society as we truly are. In a country of over 100 million people, only a few dozen certified endocrinologists offer gender-affirming care. Growing up, I relied on other trans people to find hormones, figuring out the right dosages through community hearsay, transitioning entirely without proper medical supervision. There was no other choice back then, and for many today, DIY is still the only option. So we were talking about how different the Philippines are in terms of treatment or visibility of trans people. But as you say, it's hardly acceptance.
Yeah. I am. I care so much to the many activists in the community that are working towards this. That in as much as this thing that I'm sharing about the culture of visibility in the Philippines is still to this day, and it's hypocrisy. It's complete erasure of the full humanity of trans people. I have so many friends from my life when I was doing pageants in the Philippines that are now living in America, and we would get together and when we talk about this, and we were like, just imagine what our life would be if we're not still recognized as the woman that we are, like the way that we are here in the U.S. Certainly, again, being politically recognized in your document is one thing, but it's we're not seen as full citizens in the Philippines. To still be seen as male in your documents when you're applying for a job, how could you properly dignified and say that I'm qualified for the job when the conversation is about like, oh, your documents doesn't match who you are? From the most simple thing to I have friends, lots of friends, still to this day, lots of friends I would hear that would die because of an overdose in their medication because there's no proper supervision, medical supervision. But we had to do what we had to do at that time to self-medicate, to rely on each other and the trust in the community, which again comes down to going back again, we're so very communal in the Philippines.
When you were 19, you went to Thailand to get gender affirmation surgery.
Mm-hmm.
And your mom came with you. Again, an example of how incredibly supportive she was to you. Can you talk about that experience with your mom?
Just take a, excuse me.
Yeah, of course.
I wouldn't be here without the love of my mom, going with me to Thailand and to go through that. My mom is super Catholic still. I mean, I can't question her Bible. She would hang up the phone. But the love that she has and support, never question any of that decision about who I am. Going, a Catholic mother supporting her trans daughter fully. I mean, we went to have an irreversible surgery in a suburb where nobody spoke English, and she was like, "I'm coming with you. I will hold your hand, give you my rosary before you go into your operation, and to be there." It was exactly what I needed, and it was obviously a big decision. Lots of fear going through my head in what my life would have been if I didn't have the support and love of my mom particularly. That trip going to Thailand made it all easy because of my mom, and we also had fun. My mom is fun, and she. It's the most daunting task to go through it, right? But also the knowledge that I'm about to do something for me, and what it could do to me, and how I would feel after, and to see my mom laying next to me in the hospital bed, giving me food, when I'm complaining about the hospital food. She would go out, and this is in a suburb, so nobody spoke English. And she would just do the sign language to get me the soup or the fried fish that I want, and she did that.
You also have, or had, a trans mom, Tiger Lily, a woman who would become your lifelong friend and mentor. You met her when you were 15 years old. So tell us about the role she played in your life.
Oh, Tiger Lily. I just called her, on the way here. We speak all the time. I've known...
She's still in the Philippines?
She's still in the Philippines. I've known Tiger Lily since I was 15. Another woman that changed my life. I was 15 when I met her, saw something in me. She asked me to join my first pageant, and that pageant that I shared called Super Sirena, which is this televised pageant. I remember I was 15 years old. I was still in high school. We don't have middle school in the Philippines, so 16 you graduate 16 high school. But I was also a smart student, so I was early. So I graduated when I was 15. And I remember just watching one of the finals of this pageant. I was still in school watching it. It was amazing seeing all the girls dreaming, but also not vocalizing that I want to be like them. And little did I know, a week and a half later, I would meet Tiger Lily and I would join trans pageant. Somehow she saw something in me. She made me try on the swimsuit. I felt, sexy, wearing that two-piece neon swimsuit. And she saw the confidence. She made me join that pageant. And I, the woman that I was seeing on television was in that competition. I beat all of them. I won best in swimsuit, best in long gown. Like, it was like a fantasy world. And she took me on, and then our life journey together has been, magical, I'd say. And she's really that person who, my mom moved to America by that time, and she kind of, she became my other mother. She was my chosen mother. She was my best friend. She was also my pageant manager, all at once.
I wondered about your mom moving to America when you were still pretty young.
Yeah.
Why did she decide to move to California?
My mom's side of my family has been in the U.S. since the 1960s. My mom's cousin joined the Army, so part of that petition process, the green card gets passed down. It's for a better life, right? But I think I also know now I could speak about this because from observation, from remembering how she felt about my dad and just wanting to get away from it. So I'd like to think it's those both forces, the way to have a better life so she could provide for us. But at the same time, life of, a husband that becomes violent at night especially when he drinks.
You decided to join your mom in California. It was after you won the Miss Gay Universe pageant in 2000. That was a huge deal for people who may not be familiar with the different pageants. That was the biggest. major deal.
Yeah, that was the biggest, and for me to have won that at such a young age. And
you were how old?
I was 16, about to turn 17. And I started pageant at 15. And I'd like to say, too, I would have this conversation with my trans family. It was amazing what that sort of pageant reign that I did, because I wasn't a pageant queen for I was only doing it for 2.5 years, but I reached the top at such a young age, became a pageant diva, making a lot of money, the most popular trans pageant queen. And to win that big one was was the biggest moment, and that just solidified my legacy in the pageant culture. That still to this day, everybody knows that hairstyle, that look, that walk, that swimsuit that I had, it left that mark. But little did I know, as I shared in the book, just around the corner, what was being presented to me was a choice that I would have to make. At the time in the Philippines, and still, somehow still to this day, once you're done with your pageant, the rite of passage for young, femme express, young femboy, young trans youth that wants to join pageant. Once you've done the pageant, you usually go to Japan and become an entertainer. You work in cabarets and karaoke bars, so sort of continue that life. And my mom one day called me and she said, your green card petition came through. You're now moving to the U.S. And initially I said no to her because I was a pageant diva. I was a pageant queen in the Philippines. I'm making so much money, all of that thing as a young, pageant queen, as an overachiever. And I thought I was going to move to Japan. But then when she came back to me and she said, when you move to the U.S., you could change your name and gender marker in your legal documents. And that did it for me. There was no question. There was no coming back. Just the thought of seeing fully who I am reflected in legal documents was... I couldn't believe it's even possible, when she said that to me. It's still, because to this day, it's not possible in the Philippines, especially at the time, to be presented with that. And that's obviously credit to my mom that truly loves me, that really see who I could become.
And that's when you became Geena with 2 E's and not an I. And that was your mom's idea. In a way, you write about how she was renaming you. Mm-hmm. As her daughter at that moment in time. But you also write...
I think she says that, don't do the Geena basics. No shade on Gina, but this is my mom saying. We were in the, at a place at the court when I was writing the paperwork on Gina, because that was my name in the Philippines, Gina, from another Geena, and there's so many Geenas in my life that kept on coming back. Yeah, she says that. Don't do basic, do something different. 2 E's. I don't hear that. So I was like, okay, Mom, you're renaming me. Let's do this. So,
and you got that F on your document, but you write that you were legally recognized but culturally misunderstood. So it almost sounds like the opposite of what your experience was like in the Philippines.
It was. And as a 17-year-old trans Filipina that's a young immigrant, 17, a culture shock. That was the biggest culture shock for me. The first question I asked my mom, where's the trans pageants? There's no trans pageant here. It's I can't continue that life. What am I going to do? And thank God I found a community of trans Filipinas at the time it's called AAPI Wellness Center, which is a community center that caters to AAPI, LGBTQ, young immigrant, particularly they have a trans program that took me in. I met my friends there in San Francisco, and I found out that they're all working at Macy's in cosmetics. So I was like, girl, you're here. We're going to take you to Macy's and work there in cosmetics, even though I don't know how to apply makeup, But they're all there. My friends were all there, 17 years old. Of course I'm going to work at Macy's. And I worked there. So I found that community. But also knowing that in my head, how do I continue that life of being on stage, performing in the arts? I guess I'd say that. But slowly, I think that dream it died. For many, many years, I had forgotten that dream of wanting to be a fashion model or wanting to be on stage again, because there was nothing like that. We have community-based pageants in San Francisco, but not like how it's part of the system where you could make a lot of money. There's pageants every day. Nothing like that.
And that's when you decided to move to New York?
The decision to move to New York, because of many... The person that I met that told me about moving to New York City, but also it's just all all that feeling of, I remember the first representation that I saw of a trans woman on TV was Jerry Springer. And you could imagine what that felt like. It's all shame. It's all like, you're horrible.
A circus.
You're a circus. You're a man. You're dead, And I feel like it represented a lot of how America sees, trans people. That is the amalgamation of all those forces, that how the understanding of transness and gender fluidity and the shame component. I know we spoke about shame, and that's a really big part of it. What I saw in media put a lot of shame in me. That's why I've forgotten that part of me of wanting to
be
on
more
stage.
A public figure.
Exactly. And then but somehow I met this model who used to model in New York City while working at Macy's. And she said, if you really want to do this, you have to move to New York City. And I was like, okay, I'm going to move to New York City. And because of that thought, it opened up that whole floodgate again of wanting to be a model.
You talk about playing Jenga with your life. And we mentioned we talked about in the aforementioned John Legend video this kind of state of suspended animation you were in. And there was a memory that kept you from publicly declaring, that you are trans. And that was a woman named Tula, who was another trans model. And she came before you, and she was a huge source of inspiration, but she also stoked a lot of the fear you had.
God, sometimes I look back, it's like, why did I make that choice? Obviously, there was a spark of that dream of inspiration, because she's been a community tale almost like this mythical figure, even when I was in the Philippines, that like this Tula woman made it. Right, she was a model. She had a little, she had that moment on one of the Bond films, but she got outed, and for so long, that's what so many trans models were dealing with, is the notion that you could be outed anytime.
And her career was destroyed.
It was destroyed, and until she wrote a book and decided to fight back, and taking up that story. And obviously this was like in the early 80s, but when I moved to New York in 2005, there's not much difference in how, trans people were treated. And I had that dream. I wanted to pursue it, but the fear is always there that, anyone could out me and it would destroy people's career. Like it's well documented, it happened to so many trans women, particularly trans women of color, that the moment they got outed, they were done, discarded. So this thing of, you have this ambition to be so visible, right? Whether on Times Square billboard or doing a commercial, you want to do that, but there's risk. The bigger the job, the bigger the paranoia that I was going through. And honestly, right now, even speaking to you in this voice, in this tone, I used to always calculate the little tones of how I speak, how I talk to someone. Am I drinking enough, water so that my voice is more fluid? Like these are the kind of things that was going through my head. And
you talked about, like, would someone see your Adam's apple during the making of that John Legend video, and and then when someone asked to talk to you, you were terrified that you had been found out.
Yeah, it's see, this is part of the complication of that moment in my journey as I look back, as I process, and obviously writing this book. And I kind of, I alluded in the book that I felt like I was a spy. I felt like I was in a clandestine operation every day of my life. And I think now it makes sense why I like spy genres, because why I connect with them, because I really felt like I had to put up this cover, enabled to succeed. And
by the way, I mean, you were incredibly successful. As you said, you were doing commercials, you were having billboards in Times Square, you were doing music videos. I mean, you were really having a moment there.
I was,
And you didn't want to throw it all away.
It was survival. It was whatever that next step would lead me to. Just like any trajectory of a fashion model, that you want to get the bigger exposure, you want to get that cosmetic contracts. All of that trajectory. I was in that process. But deep inside, the dual reality was just. It was paranoia to the max. That I
And paralyzing, too, I think.
It took, writing this book is the first time I truly recognized what an emotional toll that was for me.
What made you finally say, screw it, I am going to tell the world who I am and I'm going to tell my story?
There's so many moments, I guess because I was in that process, there were so many little hints that maybe I want to do it. When am I going to do it? Questioning and overanalyzing what could happen in my career. But because I was going through that, and I was going through that process, it took its toll. It manifested, in a physical condition. Certainly I was very depressed. I know that. The anguish, emotional anguish, the mental anguish of having to always edit my story.
And always being on guard. That's stressful.
Everything that I had to do, every waking life, I have to, the kind of relationship that I would have to figure out, Good thing I have a friend named Erica, who's my best friend, who is the one person that knows everything, I had, a very crazy moment of eczema that manifested in my body. It just somehow, it took over my body that I got to the point that I thought I'll never be able to wear swimsuit. There's still some marks here and there, and it's now a present thing when I get stressed. It comes up. And I listened to that, but that was the big outbreak where it was all over my body. And it took a woman, dermatologist, who sat me down and said, after giving me all the steroids in everything, nothing was working. And she said, what is going on emotionally, spiritually, psychologically? You need to listen to whatever that's going on. Didn't tell her, obviously, that I'm trans, but I knew exactly what she's talking about. Like, my truth was quite literally coming out of my body, wanting to come out. And so I listened to that. My partner and I went to Tulum, Mexico for my 30th birthday. And somehow, that magical moment when he asked me what does turning 30 means to me, somehow it felt so pure in that moment to say it. I was I was turning 30. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to, tell my story. And I somehow, once I made that decision,